Welcome back to the Reecie Colbert Show here on SiriusXM UrbanView. I am so thrilled with my guest for today's Reecie Colbert Show. She is Congresswoman Barbara Lee, a relentless advocate for justice who has broken barriers from her segregated hometown to Capitol Hill. From becoming her high school's first Black cheerleader to championing California's Violence Against Women Act, she has been a progressive, pioneering voice for decades. Now she's running for Senate in the state of California, continuing her fight for progressive values and human rights. Congresswoman Lee, welcome to the Reecie Colbert Show.
Really happy to be with you, Reecie. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, of course. When you announced your candidacy, I was so excited, particularly because of the emptiness when it comes to the U.S. Senate of having a Black woman in the Senate since Vice President Kamala Harris vacated her seat. But one of the things I did want to talk about is the fallacy of electability. And we know that when it comes to Black candidates in particular, there's always this notion that you have to convince the greater electorate that you're electable. There's always this notion that this is an important race, so we have to go with a sure bet, which people tend to not automatically ascribe to Black candidates. And then there's the additional layer now of people feeling like, some people in the electorate feeling like it's time to champion younger voices. But you have the experience, you have the wisdom, you have the receipts. And I think that California has shown that a Black woman does belong in the U.S. Senate from that state. So can you talk about your path to a top 2 jungle primary finish and then a general election victory next year in 2024?
Sure, Reecie, and let me just say a couple of things. We know that systemic racism is embedded in our campaign finance laws.
Right.
We've got to get to public financing of campaigns. That's the playing field. Having said that, when you look at how Black women continue to fight to win these seats, we have to do it our way. And we have to do it in a way that allows for us to win in a, I won't say non-traditional, but in a way that widens our lane that's out of the box. When you look at Mayor Bass, who is a good friend and who did a phenomenal job in her race, she raised and spent $9 million. Her opponent spent over $100 million of his own money. Mayor Bass today of the great city of Los Angeles.
Right.
And she did this in a way where people were involved. She put together a coalition. She put together a coalition of young people. It was multi-generational, multiracial, and she won. And so it's how Black women put together the campaign that really is a winning campaign is what we are doing. We're raising money to win this campaign. We're looking at this jungle primary. It's of course, the top 2. And our lane is very clear. The polls have shown I'm at 13%. My opponent's one is at 16%. The other is at 19%.
Right.
It also shows that when people get to know me, and experience matters right now, and representation matters, Reecie. And so young people, Gen Zers, the San Diego Young Democrats, I have an army of young people who understand that experience matters, and they're helping me in this campaign like you would not believe. And so when people get to know me, know my history, know my lived experiences, and how I have delivered for people in my district and throughout the state of California, then many of the undecideds, of which there are about 40%, come my way. And so this is an aggressive, assertive campaign, and it's a campaign that's multi-generational. It's a campaign where we're raising the money in the way Black women raise money, and it's a winning campaign in terms of making sure we get into the top 2 in March.
Absolutely. There's a saying, money can't buy you love. And I think that Congresswoman, now Mayor Bass's campaign is a prime example of that. And I'm glad you mentioned your polling, because I remember at the beginning of your campaign, there was a lot of talk about kind of trying to characterize you as a distant third, particularly around the idea that you are not fundraising as much. But to your point, the more that you've been out there, and I've seen you do the work, doing rallies, doing, intimate discussions questions with folks, your poll numbers are reflecting that that interest, and that it reflects that this is very much competitive. So I definitely see that there is a path there as long as people get a chance to get to know you better, which I think your record speaks for itself on that.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Also speaks to raising money, because
Yeah.
we have to raise the money to make sure people get a chance to know me. And
Right.
because many people who want to know more about me. And so we have to raise money. And I just have to say, my website is barbaraleeforca.com, because we want people to know that they can go to my website, they can contribute, or they can get to know me better through the website, and encourage people to really get on board. And it would help tremendously for that.
Yes. So if you're listening out there, go ahead and go to barbaraleeforca.com, because the reality is that people lament the fact that there's so much money in politics, and these people are bought by corporations and this interest, but then they turn around and they don't support the people that aren't being bought off. And so you can't have it both ways. You either got to go ahead and chip in $5 here, $10 there, or you got to deal with, campaign seats being bought and paid for by the wealthiest people in this country. So
I'll make one more point on this.
Of course. Yeah.
Important for people to understand. Since 1789, when the first House and Senate went into session, there have been 2 African-American women in the United States Senate. That's Senator Carol Moseley Braun, who's endorsed me and helping me tremendously, and Vice President Kamala Harris, serving a total of 10 years, mind you, a total of 1789. And so representation matters, and the lens that Black women bring to all of the policy discussions has been missing in the Senate. And so that's another issue that people need to really understand when it comes to evaluating my ability to represent and to deliver for people in California.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And we are in a position, I think, with this 2024 election cycle, where there are several viable and competitive Black women across the country running for U.S. Senate. But that does not mean that because you have more than one, that means that any individual one is any less important, because we are at least 7% of the country. So even if all three of, you have County Executive Angela Alsobrooks in Maryland, who's running for the nomination. You have Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's running for the nomination in Delaware. Even if all three of you were to become U.S. senators in 2024, that still only makes 3% of the Senate.
Right. And Reecie, I've done a fundraiser with my sisters who are running, and one is not enough.
Right. It's not
enough. And so we have to make sure that every Black woman is elected to the United States. And we still are underrepresented, even with 3, even with 4. We need at least 7 to 10 to even level the playing field at this point.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Much of the political discussion, though, I would say, who gets attention is based on personality and based on rhetoric. It's based on, stunts. I'm not going to name no names, but that's what I would characterize it as. But it's not so much based on who has the receipts. What should voters, or like you said, people who are interested in getting involved in your campaign throughout the country, what should they know about your actual record and the receipts that you bring to this campaign?
Sure. Let me say a couple of things. First, I hope people look at my record. I was in the California Assembly and California Senate. And during that period, we had a Republican governor, and I got more bills signed into law than any other Democrat. And I share that because people need to know, even though I disagree with Republicans, I know how to work with them to get the job done. I, for example, passed the legislation, the Violence Against Women Act for California. I set up a children's health program in California. I've had 8 or 9 bills with regard to domestic violence passed and signed into law in California. I have a lens that is very, very broad, and however, I work very closely with Republicans to try to get the job done. I led on the overall global AIDS initiative when President Bush was in office. Africa were dying every day, all day, from HIV and AIDS. And I went to President Bush and I said, look, we have got to have a global AIDS initiative that addresses not only African Americans in our own country, but throughout the world. And he signed. I worked with him and Henry Hyde and all of the Republicans and got my bill signed into law. that addresses global AIDS. And I've helped save, because of my ability to work with Republicans, over 25 million lives just on that point alone. Right. When President Bush came to Congress for an authorization to use military force to go to war 3 days after the horrific attacks of 9/11, 3 days to set the stage for forever war. It was a blank check, and there's no way I could vote for that. I voted against it. I was the only one who voted against it, but that was the right vote, Reece. Now I'm trying to repeal that authorization, and I have at least 49 Republicans, MAGA extremists, who are working with me along with Democrats to repeal that authorization and the Iraq authorization. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to see my record and how I've been able to impact people's lives. When you look at the money I have delivered, I'm on the Appropriations Committee and on the Budget Committee. During the height of COVID, I was the one that championed the COVID Community Care Act and brought millions of dollars into Black and underserved communities. And I had a big fight with many Democrats to try to target these resources, but we survived because I was able to target the resources for trusted messengers, because we were very reluctant to address COVID in our communities. So I said, no, we have to pay people in our communities to train and pay people to deliver these messages. I did that. When you look at reproductive rights, I co-chair the pro-choice caucus. The Hyde Amendment has been an amendment that denies primarily low-income African-American and women of color access to the full range of reproductive health care, including abortions. I had to break that glass ceiling in the Congress with Democrats to say we have got to repeal the Hyde Amendment because it's discriminatory. And so we got the repeal. My bill, the EACH Act, I built over 160 co-sponsors, but I had to really fight and explain this to Democrats, why this was important. Yeah. And in fact, it comes in the appropriations bill, and I was able to keep it out of the appropriations bills for 2 years. Of course, the Senate put it back in, but that's an example of how I've had to step out. I co-chair the Cannabis Caucus. I was the first member of Congress to introduce the Marijuana Justice Act, to expunge the records of those convicted of misdemeanors, dealing with this war on drugs. It was Barbara Lee stepped out there and got the Congress to focus on the criminal justice aspects of cannabis. And I can go on and on and on. Yeah. But thank you for asking me that question. I don't get a chance to talk about my background, but I hope people get to my website. But I've done a lot of work and I've delivered for people throughout my elected life.
Absolutely. And that website again is barbaralee4ca.com. That's what I call the CVS receipts. You buy a stick of gum and then it's like 3 pages of receipts because it's like, okay, you got to come back. You got to get this, that, and the other. That's the kind of receipts that you were just delivering there. And there are some people that can't even get a bill out of committee. There are some people that don't pass legislation and they don't really make an impact, but they get outside attention despite their lack of actual receipts in terms of their performance in the Congress. I think it's really important that people make that distinction between someone who's done the work as opposed to somebody who's just talked about doing the work.
Let me say one other thing about that, because my lived experiences are extremely important. In California, we have 40 million people. 20 are living one paycheck away from poverty. I was on public assistance when I was a student after a terrible marriage. I raised 2 single, phenomenal young children, boys, now great young men. And I was on Medi-Cal, I was on public assistance, I was on food stamps. And let me tell you, it was really hard. I could not afford childcare. I had to take my kids to class with me. Here we are in 2023. Women and families can't afford childcare still. And so childcare is a big issue. And I use that as an example because I've championed issues around lifting people out of poverty and really had to push our Democratic caucus to establish a task force on poverty and opportunity, which I chair. But when we finally did that, guess what? Over 100 members joined. And so we want to look at how we develop initiatives and strategies and policies to lift people out of poverty. I'm the only candidate in the race who's had those lived experiences and who has used those lived experiences to develop funding priorities and to develop policy initiatives that address the issues that especially so many young single women of color and families of color have to deal with in California.
No, absolutely. And I think it's so important that you talked about lived experiences and being able to connect with voters, because a lot of people are disaffected and disillusioned, and we can run down the metrics, how the GDP has grown and how and inflation is going down and how wages have ticked up or how unemployment is low. But people aren't necessarily feeling that, and to the extent that we can tout the accomplishments on a numeric level. And so your ability to connect with those people, I think, is really key. How are you specifically reaching those folks and connecting the dots between, hey, this is my experience, this is what I'm working on in Congress, these are the kinds of issues that I've helped move the needle on, and this is why I would be a champion for you? Do you find that that's resonating with voters that you've been interacting with?
It's resonating with voters up and down the states. I went into the Central Valley, and I'm on the Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture. In the Central, I'm the only Democrat west of the Mississippi on that. I went into the Central Valley. Food insecurity is rampant, Reecie, in the Central Valley.
Yeah.
Who has led on the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. Here we have food insecurity rampant in the breadbasket of the country. And so leading on SNAP benefits, leading on the Healthy Food Financing Initiative, what I've done for small farmers in the Central Valley, all of these issues are addressed to people who are living on the edge and who need to have a government that responds to them. Also, and so the Central Valley, we went everywhere, and people everywhere in the Central Valley understood and got it. We've got a lot of support in the Central Valley. There's a film out that, and let me just mention this, the NAACP Image Awards 2 years ago awarded this documentary that was made on about myself, which I didn't want to do, but the film writer, the producer, she followed me everywhere. She said it took 3 years instead of a year because I was so reluctant and resistant. But there's a film, it's called Barbara Lee Speaking Truth to Power. It has a lot of my lived experiences and how I work with people to get people to understand I see them and that I'm going to help make their lives better. She covered a lot of my issues. When I was in Wisconsin with Congresswoman Gwen Moore, we went to a child care center. We talked about child care and early childhood development, why that is so important for poor families and for African-American and families of color. And so that film is on Amazon Prime. So if people want to see more about this, I mean, I ended up not having a place to live, homeless after a marriage. There was a marriage filled with domestic violence. And so I understand what affordable housing means and what it means not to have a place to live.
Yeah.
And in California, we have huge numbers of people who are unsheltered. And I understand what that is. And so people do connect when I talk to them and when they meet me or when we when we provide the information to them, they say, oh, yeah, she gets it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, Congresswoman, I've held you over a little bit longer, but I just have one more question that I want to ask you because I think I talked about a little bit earlier about who gets the attention, and pundits really drive a lot of the local and national conversation around Senate races like yours. Now, they don't necessarily move the needle in terms of who comes out to vote, but the conversations and narratives do influence the money that you get to raise. And so I just want to know, before you head out, what are those people missing? The people that are not at your rallies, the people that are not seeing these conversations that you are having, or people who haven't necessarily done the work to look at your record and see what you bring to the table. What would you say to the pundit class about how they are calling this race?
I would say look deeper, because we have to have an informed electorate. And don't just because people get on cable television more often, we understand what the racism and the media. Quite. And when you look at the fact that certain people get the media attention, okay, that's what they're getting. But when you look at what candidates have done and what they have delivered for people to make their lives better, then you have to dig deeper. And so, and people are struggling to survive. And I understand people don't have time to get off into reading a lot about all the candidates. It's the last you see on television. But I would encourage, especially in California, to look at how race matters. Racial equity is a big issue here in California with the end of affirmative action. Who is the candidate that's going to fight for racial and economic equity, and who has been fighting for that, who sees people who live below the poverty line? So ask a few questions about the voters, and who brings diversity and who can fill gaps. Because when you have opponents who are very similar to the current Senate, you're not going to change the Senate.
Right.
And we have to change the Senate. We've got to end the filibuster. We've got to protect our democracy, which means making sure our voting rights are protected. So voters who haven't dug deep, but who needs to understand how important our democracy is, look at who's fought for voting rights, who's fought against the rollback on reproductive freedom, who's fought against the rollbacks on LGBTQ plus rights. It's Barbara Lee who's done all that, who's done the work. Right. And so I'm not on, the media doesn't put me on as much as they put on my opponents in terms of being in front of people, because I don't have a lot of gimmicks.
Right.
But I work and I do the representation and I deliver for people. And that's what's important for people to know. I'm committed to making their lives better. This is not a campaign for Barbara Lee. I don't want to be in the Senate for Barbara Lee. I want to be in the Senate for these young people. And young people support me. Many Gen Zers around the state support me. The San Diego Young Democrats came out and endorsed me because they know, based on my record, they know, and they tell me over and over, they trust me. And so people have to look at who they can trust at this moment, and who can fight the good fight against these MAGA extremist Republicans, and who can help organize, and who can help bring this country to a better place through the United States Senate.
Absolutely. So many key points: trust, deliver, and organize. Those are the key factors, and not just winning a race, but actually making an impact once you get that seat, what you're going to do with it. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Again, the website is BarbaraLee4CA.com. If you heard something that you liked, go on ahead and support. She named that documentary that you talked about earlier one more time.
Speak Truth to Power, and it's on Amazon Prime.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee. It's been an honor, and I wish you well. Please come back anytime to the Reecie Colbert Show.
I would love it. Thank you again. Nice being with you.
Thank you.